Sing your country's anthem, shout your land's undying fame, like the wondrous.
This book comes out of my role in the Haiti Solidarity Movement, my role in opposing the Canadian government's support for the overthrow of democracy in Haiti in 2004, participating in the Canada-Haiti Action Network. I was really taken aback by the extent to which the Canadian government had supported this brutal crime against the Haitian people. Canadian troops helped secure the airport where the former president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was forced from office by U.S. Marines. Paul Martin, Canadian Prime Minister, made the first ever trip to Haiti, not when there was an elected government in place, but rather when there was a coup government that was supporting, that had been responsible for thousands of people being killed. And I guess going into the Haiti Solidarity Movement and seeing what Canada was doing in Haiti, going into it, I guess I was a little bit naive about Canada's role in the world. Part of the motivation to write this book was to look at whether Canada had acted in similar ways elsewhere. The second motivation in writing this book was that many times when participating in Haiti Solidarity work, I found that we would engage Canadians about what Canada was doing. So we tell them that the Canadian International Development Agency is funding a highly partisan Haitian human rights organization that's basically concocted a whole story, a whole claim about a massacre, which is justifying the imprisonment of Haiti's constitutional prime minister, constitutional interior minister, and CETA, our aid dollars, are going to support this campaign very consciously. So we would tell Canadians that this is what was taking place, and many people just simply couldn't believe us. We have this conception of Canada as a force for good in the world, and what I've put together is a top 10 list of things that we should know about Canadian foreign policy that we don't. So the first one is, on dozens of occasions since 1915, Canadian gunboats have been deployed to the Caribbean and Central America. In 1917, the Royal Bank loaned $200,000 to a Costa Rican dictator by the name of Federico Tinoco, just as he was about to flee office. There was mass uprising in the country, and he was just about to flee office. And of course, when Tinoco left, he took the money with him, as most sensible observers would have understood. A couple years later, when there was negotiations between the Royal Bank and the new Costa Rican government, who said, this is odious debt, we're not going to pay this back. A couple years later, in 1921, Ottawa sent the Aurora, the Patrician, and the Patriot Canadian naval vessels to support the Royal Bank in its negotiations with the Costa Rican government. January 1932, the front page Vancouver Sun headline read, "El Salvador alive with Red Revolt." The subheadline noted, "Canadian destroyers from British Columbia to the rescue." There was a peasant uprising, indigenous uprising in El Salvador, and London, British railway banking interests, as well as some Canadian economic interests, were under threat by this uprising. And Hernandez Martinez, the president of El Salvador, was sort of waffling about sending out the troops to put down the uprising. With Canadian naval vessels in the region, London asked Ottawa to send the Canadian naval vessels, and according to the Canadian commander, Brodeur was his name, it was really the presence of these two Canadian naval vessels off the coast that provided, and the Canadian troops actually landed, that provided Martinez with the backbone to send out his troops and quash the rebellion. In El Salvador, in history, it's called La Matanza. As many as 30,000 people were killed, including Farabundo Martí. This is over a multiple-month process, including Farabundo Martí, the namesake of the FMLN, the political party that just won elections in El Salvador a couple months ago. The ninth thing that we should know about Canadian foreign policy is Canada has been the 5th or 6th largest contributor to the U.S. war in Iraq. So while officially Canada wasn't part of the coalition of the willing, behind our backs, Ottawa did all it could to support the U.S. war in Iraq. First of all, U.S. warplanes flew over Canadian airspace and refueled in Newfoundland on way to bringing U.S. troops to Iraq. Canada was in charge of Task Force 151, the NATO naval brigade patrolling the Arabian Sea in the lead up to the war. And actually, the Liberal government had legal opinion that suggested because of Canada's being in charge of Task Force 151, that Canada was legally at war with Iraq. And numerous Canadian naval vessels were involved in patrolling the coast off Iraq in the months before and the months after. At least 30 Canadian troops were involved in British and U.S. units that fought in Iraq. So while other countries that had exchange programs had troops in exchange programs with British or American units that were fighting in Iraq, they withdrew their troops. The Canadian government never withdrew its troops that were involved in British and U.S. units. Canadian military planners were involved in planning the U.S. war from Tampa, Florida. And when the American planning station moved from Tampa to Qatar, at least 25 Canadian military planners made that move. And right after the U.S. Invasion, and when the Americans were in the process of consolidating the occupation, or trying to consolidate the occupation, the Liberal government announced $300 million in Canadian aid to Iraq. And the aid was designed to support the U.S. occupation, consolidated U.S. occupation. And the history of Canadian aid, or one of the principles of Canadian aid, is that where the U.S. kills, Canada provides aid, which what I call the aid equals intervention principle. And that goes back all the way to the Korean War, where Canada provided significant aid to South Korea, the U.S. war in Vietnam, to South Vietnam. And today, the three main recipients of Canadian aid over the past few years, number one, of course, right now is Afghanistan. Number two is Haiti, and Iraq over the last few years has been probably in the third spot. And in all those cases, one of the principles is that the U.S. and Canadian troops are involved in killing people. So the eighth point about things we should know about Canadian foreign policy is that Ottawa asked London for its Caribbean colonies after World War I. So part of the mythology of Canada as a force for good in the world, or not at least being that negative a force in the world, is that Canada never officially had colonies. If you don't take the term First Nations seriously, which of course we should, if you deny the domestic colonialism, which we of course shouldn't. The seventh point about Canadian foreign policy that's, I think, very important is that days after the elected Salvador Allende was overthrown, Canada's ambassador to Chile called victims of dictator Augusto Pinochet's repression, quote, the riffraff of the Latin American left. The rest of the quote from the Canadian ambassador to Chile was that, quote, this is the Canadian ambassador in Santiago, quote, the country has been on a prolonged political binge under the elected Allende government, and the junta has assumed the probably thankless task of sobering Chile up. In that sobering up process, at least 3,000 Chileans, dissidents, were killed, supporters of the elected government. When the Canadian ambassador sent out this cable from Santiago, there were thousands of supporters of the government in the infamous soccer stadium, being illegally detained, tortured, and in many cases being killed.